So you're just gonna stand there and take it? Trent's voice cut across the cafeteria like a fork scraping porcelain, loud enough to turn heads, but casual enough to sound like a joke if anyone important asked later. And the room shifted in that subtle way rooms do when people sense something is about to happen but don't want to be part of it. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, trays sliding, a soda can cracking open somewhere in the back, and right in the center of it, Elijah Brooks held a plastic tray that wasn't his anymore because it had already tilted, already slipped, already let go, milk spreading across the white tile in a slow, deliberate shape, as if even gravity was in no hurry. And Trent stood there with one hand still half raised like he might pretend it was an accident, like he hadn't stepped just a little too close, like he hadn't leaned just enough to make contact. And Isaiah saw it all in a single breath, the angle of the shoulder, the timing, the smirk that didn't belong in a place where people were supposed to be learning things that mattered. And he reached out, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to rest his fingers against Elijah's wrist, a quiet anchor, a reminder. And Elijah didn't look at him right away, didn't look at anyone, just watched the milk crawl toward the edge of his sneaker, the white against black, the way it almost reflected the overhead lights, and there was something in his stillness that made the laughter hesitate, just for a second, like even the people holding their phones weren't sure if they should keep recording or lower them, and Trent filled that silence the way he always did, with a grin too wide, a voice just a little too loud. Man, you gotta be careful, Brooks. These floors are slippery. And a couple of his friends laughed on cue. Mason with his hand over his mouth. Cole leaning back in his chair like this was just another afternoon. Just another scene they'd all seen before. Except it wasn't. Not exactly. Because Isaiah's hand didn't tighten, didn't pull, didn't push. It just stayed there, steady. And Elijah finally blinked, slow, like he was coming back from somewhere far away. And when he looked up, his eyes didn't flare or flash. They settled, calm in a way that didn't match the moment. And that was what made the room quiet again. Not the spill, not the words, but that look, like he had already made a decision no one else understood. And Isaiah felt it, too. The echo of something older than this cafeteria. Older than this school with its polished banners and quiet rules. Something written on a piece of paper back home, taped to a refrigerator that hummed louder than these lights. 3 words that didn't need to be said out loud to be heard. And he gave the smallest shake of his head, not a command, not a warning, just a reminder. And Elijah exhaled through his nose, slow enough that only someone watching for it would notice. And he bent down, picked up the tray, set it back on the table like nothing had happened, like the spill was just a spill and not a line someone had tried to draw. And Trent tilted his head, studying him now, curiosity mixing with something sharper, like disappointment, like he'd expected more, like he wanted a reaction he could point at later and say, "See, I told you." And he took a step closer, close enough that the smell of his cologne cut through the cafeteria air. "You don't talk much, do you?" And Elijah met his eyes this time, not challenging, not avoiding, just there, present. And for a second Trent's smile faltered, just enough to be real, just enough to show that whatever he thought he understood about the twins didn't quite fit anymore. And Isaiah shifted his weight, placing himself half a step between them without making it obvious, without turning it into something bigger. And somewhere behind them a chair scraped, someone whispered, someone else laughed too late, trying to catch up with a moment that had already moved on. And Elijah finally spoke, voice even, quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear it. "I'm good." And it wasn't a surrender, wasn't an apology, just a statement that didn't give Trent anything to hold on to. And that, more than anything, seemed to irritate him, because he let out a short breath, shook his head like this was boring now, like there was no point pushing further if the show wasn't worth it, and he stepped back, bumping into Mason on purpose, already turning the moment into a joke again, already moving on to the next thing, but not before throwing one last look over his shoulder, measuring, calculating, like he'd just found a puzzle he didn't expect. And as the noise of the cafeteria slowly returned, as conversations picked back up and phones lowered, and the spill got wiped away by someone who didn't ask questions, Isaiah kept his hand where it was for one more second before letting go. And Elijah rolled his shoulders once, small, controlled, like he was putting something back in place inside himself. And neither of them said anything as they walked toward an empty table near the windows, sunlight cutting through the glass in thin, pale lines, and for anyone watching, it might have looked like nothing happened at all, just another lunch, just another day. But there was a weight in the air that hadn't been there before, a quiet shift no one could name. And across the room, Trent didn't sit down right away, just stood there a moment longer than necessary, eyes still on them, like he was trying to figure out what he'd just missed. And that was when he smiled again, slower this time, like he'd just decided something, like the game had only just started, and Isaiah saw it from the corner of his eye, the way people who learn to notice things always do. And he didn't turn, didn't react, just sat down across from his brother, the sunlight catching on the edge of the table between them. And for a brief second, everything felt too still, like the pause before a storm no one else could hear yet. And somewhere deep under that calm, something waited, not restless, not eager, just ready, as if it had been there all along, patient enough to let the world make the first move. And Trent was already planning his next one. The bell did not ring so much as it released something, a low electric buzz that rolled through the halls and pulled students out of the cafeteria in loose waves, chairs scraping, voices overlapping, sneakers squeaking against polished floors that still smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something sweet from the vending machines. And Isaiah walked a half step ahead now, not leading, not shielding, just setting a pace that did not invite interruption, while Elijah matched it without looking, their rhythm quiet and practiced, like something they had done in places far less forgiving than this. And behind them the cafeteria noise folded back into itself, as if nothing had happened, as if moments did not leave residue. But they did, they always did, and you could feel it in the way a few students glanced over their shoulders, in the way one girl lowered her phone a second too late, in the way Lila Monroe stood near the exit with her backpack hanging off one shoulder, eyes flicking from the twins to the hallway and back. Again, like she was deciding whether silence was safer than truth, and she stepped aside without saying anything as Isaiah and Elijah passed, the faint scent of her citrus shampoo cutting through the sterile air for just a second before it was gone, replaced by the cooler draft of the main corridor. And the light changed there, harsher, more direct, reflecting off trophy cases lined with names that sounded like old money and long memory. And Isaiah noticed how their reflection slid across the glass as they moved, two figures in dark hoodies, edges softened by the glare, and for a moment it almost looked like they did not belong in that reflection, like they had been placed there by mistake. And then it was gone, replaced by rows of polished plaques and photographs of smiling teams, and Elijah's gaze lingered on one of them, a group of athletes frozen mid-celebration, arms raised, faces open, and he exhaled quietly, not bitter, not longing, just aware. And Isaiah caught it, the small shift in his brother's breathing, the way his shoulders lifted then settled, and he slowed just enough to let the space between them close, not touching this time, just near. And neither of them spoke because there was nothing to explain, not here, not where every word could be overheard and turned into something else. And further down the hall a locker slammed, sharp and sudden, followed by laughter that bounced off the walls and came back thinner, like it had lost something on the way. And Trent's voice rose out of it, easy, confident, threaded with that same careless edge. And Isaiah did not need to look to know where he was, but he did anyway, just once. A quick glance that took in the angle of Trent leaning against the lockers, Mason scrolling through his phone, Cole tossing a pen into the air and catching it without thinking, and Noah Pike standing slightly apart, his expression not quite matching the others, like he had not fully decided which side of the moment he was on. And for a second their eyes met, Noah's and Isaiah's, and there was a flicker there, something uncertain, something that did not fit the script. And then Noah looked away, adjusting the strap of his backpack like it mattered more than anything else, and Isaiah turned forward again, letting the hallway stretch out in front of them, long and bright, and full of people who were already moving on, already forgetting. And Elijah's voice came low, almost lost under the hum of the building. You saw that. Not a question, just a note placed between them. And Isaiah nodded once, small, enough, yeah. And they kept walking, past classrooms with doors propped open, past a teacher writing something on the board in careful, looping letters, past the janitor's cart parked against the wall with a yellow sign folded neatly on top, the faint scent of bleach lingering like a memory you could not quite place. And Elijah's hand brushed against his own side, fingers flexing once, then stilling, like he was checking something, making sure it was still there, whatever it was he had decided to hold on to. And Isaiah felt it again, that echo from somewhere else, somewhere quieter, where decisions were not made in front of an audience, where they meant something different. And he drew in a breath, steady, measured, letting it out slowly as they reached the corner where the hallway split, one path leading toward the gym, the other toward their next class. And for a second they paused, not because they were unsure where to go, but because the moment itself seemed to hesitate, like it was waiting to see what they would choose. And behind them Trent's laughter rose again, louder now, closer, not chasing, not yet, just there, filling the space they had just left. And Isaiah glanced at Elijah, just a flick of his eyes, enough to ask without asking. And Elijah gave the smallest nod, a mirror of his earlier calm, and they turned left together, toward the classroom, toward the part of the day that was supposed to be ordinary, even if nothing felt that way anymore. And as they stepped through the doorway, the noise of the hallway softened, the light shifted, and for a moment it almost felt like a boundary had been crossed, like something had been set in motion that would not be easy to stop. And Isaiah felt it settle in his chest, quiet but certain, like a clock starting to tick somewhere no one else could hear. And he knew without knowing how that this was not going to end where it began. The classroom carried a different kind of quiet, not the empty kind but the controlled kind, where every sound had a place and every movement felt slightly measured. The hum of the projector, the faint scratch of dry erase marker against the board, the soft shuffle of notebooks opening as students settled into rows that had already decided who belonged where. And Isaiah took the seat near the window without hesitation, not because it was better, but because it gave him something steady to look at when the room felt too full, while Elijah dropped into the desk beside him, leaning back just enough to stretch his shoulders, his eyes scanning once, quick and precise, taking in exits, distances, faces, not out of fear but habit. And Mrs. Alvarez continued writing as if none of it mattered, as if whatever happened in the hallway stayed there, sealed behind the door like a different world. And for a few minutes it almost worked, almost felt normal, numbers appearing on the board, instructions given in a calm, even tone, the routine of school wrapping itself around the moment like a thin layer of paint over something deeper. But Isaiah could still feel it, that shift from earlier, sitting just under the surface, and he rested his forearms on the desk, fingers loosely interlocked, breathing steady, controlled, the way he had been taught, the way he had practiced so many times it no longer required thought. And Elijah tapped his pencil once, then stopped, catching himself, placing it down flat like even that small sound carried more weight than it should. And across the room a whisper broke, low but not low enough, someone asking someone else what happened in the cafeteria, a quick retelling already changing shape, already becoming something slightly different. And Isaiah did not turn, did not listen, but he heard it anyway, the way you hear rain even when you are not looking out the window. And then another voice, quieter, closer, Lila's. It was not like that, soft but firm, and the whisper shifted again, uncertain now, and Elijah's gaze flicked toward her for a second, just enough to register, then back to the front, and Mrs. Alvarez turned, marker in hand. "Let us focus," she said, not sharp, just tired in a way that suggested she had seen this before, many times, in many forms, and the class obeyed, at least on the surface, heads lowering, pens moving. But the air held on to the earlier tension like static, and Isaiah let his eyes drift to the window, where the late afternoon light had begun to soften, stretching long across the grass outside. And for a moment he was somewhere else, not in this room, not in this school, but in a smaller space with walls that echoed differently, where the air smelled like rubber mats and sweat, and something clean underneath it, where footsteps sounded heavier and more intentional, and a voice, steady and calm, said the same thing over and over until it stopped being instruction and became something else entirely. Control is not about force, it is about choice. And Isaiah blinked, bringing himself back, the classroom snapping into focus again, and he shifted slightly, grounding himself in the present, the edge of the desk against his forearm, the faint vibration of someone's phone on silent 2 rows over, the steady cadence of Mrs. Alvarez explaining a problem that had a clear answer, something that could be solved if you followed the steps, if you stayed within the lines. And Elijah leaned forward now, elbows on the desk, eyes on the board, But Isaiah could see the tension still there, not in his posture, but in the way his jaw set just a fraction tighter than usual, and he spoke without looking, voice low enough that it did not travel beyond their space. "You are good," echoing what Elijah had said earlier, turning it back, not as reassurance, but as recognition. And Elijah huffed a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "I know," he said, and there was something in that, something steadying, like a piece clicking back into place, and for a few minutes more the room held. The lesson moved forward, pencils scratched, pages turned, and it could have stayed. Like that. It almost did, until the door opened just enough to break the seal. A knock that was more of a formality than a request, and a student aide stepped in, whispering something to Mrs. Alvarez, who nodded, glancing toward the class before her eyes landed, briefly, on Isaiah and Elijah, not accusing, not even concerned, just aware, and then the aide stepped aside, leaving the door open a few inches wider than before. And through that narrow gap came the distant echo of laughter from the hallway, familiar now, unmistakable, and Elijah's pencil rolled slowly across his desk before stopping against his notebook, and he did not reach for it right away, just watched it settle, and Isaiah followed his gaze for a second, then lifted his eyes toward the door, toward that thin slice of the outside world pressing in, and something about it felt different this time, less like a memory and more like an invitation. And neither of them moved as the sound grew just a little closer. The door never fully closed after the aide left, and that small gap changed everything, letting the hallway breathe into the room in thin, uneven pulses of sound, footsteps, locker doors, laughter that came and went like it had somewhere more important to be, and Mrs. Alvarez paused just long enough to notice it, her eyes flicking toward the opening before returning to the board, her voice steady as she continued. But the rhythm had shifted, just enough that anyone paying attention could feel it, and Isaiah felt it first in his shoulders, a quiet tightening that did not show on his face, while Elijah's gaze remained on the pencil resting against his notebook, unmoving, as if waiting for a signal that had not come yet. And across the room Lila adjusted in her seat, her attention no longer on the lesson but on that sliver of hallway, like she was listening for something specific. Something she had already heard once before and did not want to hear again. And then it came, not loud, not dramatic, just Trent's voice sliding into the edge of the room like it belonged there. "Yeah, I saw them. Casual, easy, close enough now that the distance between spaces felt thin, like a wall you could see through if you tried, and a few students shifted, glancing toward the door, pretending not to, and Mrs. Alvarez stopped writing this time. The marker hovering midair for a second before she set it down with more care than necessary. "I will close that," she said, almost to herself, and she walked toward the door, each step measured, controlled, but just as her hand reached for the handle, Trent's shadow crossed the opening, not stepping in, not yet, just enough to interrupt the boundary, and he leaned slightly, looking past her into the room with that same half-smile. "Sorry, did not mean to interrupt," he said, though nothing in his tone suggested apology, and Mrs. Alvarez held his gaze for a moment, something unspoken passing between them, not confrontation, not agreement, just a recognition of roles that had already been set, and she closed the door anyway, firm but not forceful, the click of the latch sealing the room again, and for a second it worked, the outside sound cut off, the classroom returning to its contained quiet, but the interruption had already settled in, like dust that would not fully clear, and Mrs. Alvarez turned back, smoothing the front of her blouse, picking up the marker again. "Let us continue," she said, and the class followed, at least in appearance. But the focus had shifted, attention split between what was being taught and what had just brushed against it. And Isaiah leaned back slightly, his chair creaking softly under his weight, and he let his eyes close for a fraction of a second, just long enough to reset, to pull himself fully into the present, and when he opened them, he did not look at the door, did not look at Trent, even though he could feel him out there, just beyond the wall, moving, waiting, deciding, and Elijah finally reached for his pencil, picking it up, turning it once between his fingers before setting it down again, more deliberately this time, and he leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his posture settling into something that looked like attention but carried something deeper, something held in. "Check." And Isaiah spoke again, barely above a breath. "It is just noise." And Elijah nodded once, slow. "Yeah." But his eyes did not soften, did not drift. They stayed fixed, steady in a way that suggested he was listening to more than what could be heard. And across the aisle Noah shifted in his seat, glancing toward the door, then toward the twins, then back down at his desk, his pen hovering above his paper without moving, like he had forgotten what he was supposed to be doing. And the seconds stretched, thin and quiet, until the bell rang again, sharper this time, signaling the end of the period, and the room broke open all at once, chairs sliding back, voices rising, the controlled quiet dissolving into motion. And Mrs. Alvarez stepped aside to let students pass, her expression composed, unreadable, as if she had decided something she would not say out loud. And Isaiah stood, gathering his things with practiced efficiency, no rush, no hesitation, while Elijah slung his backpack over one shoulder, his movements smooth, contained, and as they moved toward the door, the air felt different again, heavier, like stepping from one temperature into another. And when Mrs. Alvarez opened it, the hallway flooded back in, louder now, closer, and Trent was there, leaning against the lockers. Exactly where Isaiah had expected him to be, like he had not moved at all, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. And his eyes met theirs without surprise, without urgency, just a quiet certainty that this was not over, not even close. And for a brief second, everything slowed, the noise fading just enough to leave that look hanging between them, unspoken but clear. And Isaiah felt the weight of it settle, not as a threat, not as fear, but as something that would require an answer, sooner than either of them wanted. And Elijah stepped forward, not stopping, not hesitating, passing by Trent with just enough space to make it a choice, not an accident. And Trent's smile widened slightly, like he had been given exactly what he needed. And as Isaiah followed, he caught a glimpse of Noah again, standing just behind Trent, his expression tighter now, less certain than before. And Isaiah filed it away without thinking. Another detail in a moment that was building itself piece by piece. And as they moved down the hallway, the sound of footsteps falling in behind them came just a fraction too quickly to be coincidence. The footsteps behind them did not rush, did not call out, did not need to. They simply stayed there, measured and steady, close enough to be noticed, but not close enough to be obvious. And Isaiah did not turn. Not yet. He just adjusted his pace slightly, testing the rhythm. And Elijah felt it immediately, matching him without a word, their strides falling into sync like something practiced long before this hallway. And the lockers on either side reflected them in broken fragments, steel doors catching pieces of movement, pieces of faces, never the whole picture. And for a moment it felt like walking through a place that could not quite hold them together. And then Trent's voice came again. Closer now, almost conversational. "You guys always this quiet?" And it slid between them without permission, like it belonged there. And Elijah kept walking, eyes forward, but his fingers curled once against the strap of his backpack, a small motion that did not escape Isaiah. And Isaiah slowed just enough to let the space behind them close, not stopping, just allowing the moment to arrive. And Trent stepped up alongside them, matching their pace now, Mason and Cole drifting just behind, forming a loose line that turned the hallway into something narrower than it was. And Noah was there too, a step off to the side, not quite in it, not quite out, his gaze shifting between faces like he was still trying to decide what this was supposed to be. And Isaiah finally turned his head, just enough to acknowledge, not enough to engage, his expression neutral, calm in a way that did not invite escalation but did not retreat either. And Trent smiled like he had been waiting for that exact angle. "You know, people talk," he said, casual, like he was discussing the weather. New guys, scholarship, all that. And he gestured lightly with his hand, as if the words carried no weight, as if they were just part of the air. And Elijah's jaw tightened again, not visible to most, but Isaiah saw it, felt it, the same way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. And he spoke before Elijah could, voice even, steady. "People always talk." And it was not a challenge, not an invitation, just a fact placed gently in the space between them. And for a second Trent's smile shifted, just a fraction, like he had expected something sharper, something easier to push against. And Mason let out a small laugh behind him, filling the gap. "Yeah, but not like this," he said, glancing around as if the hallway itself was listening, and a couple of students nearby slowed, pretending to check their phones, pretending not to watch, and the air grew heavier again. Not loud, not chaotic, just thick with attention, and Elijah exhaled slowly, turning his head now, meeting Trent's gaze fully for the first time since the cafeteria, and there was no heat in it, no flare, just a quiet intensity that did not match the tone of the conversation, and he said, "We are just here for school. Simple, direct, nothing more," and Trent tilted his head, studying him, like he was trying to find the edge of something that did not show itself easily. "Yeah," he said, "looks like you are here for something else," and he let the words hang there, vague enough to mean anything, pointed enough to mean something, and Isaiah shifted his weight slightly, placing himself just a fraction closer to Elijah again, not blocking, not guarding, just there, and he said, "You are reading too much into it," and his tone did not rise, did not harden, it stayed level, controlled, and that seemed to unsettle Trent more than any reaction would have, because he took a small step back, not retreating, just resetting, like he needed a different angle, and Noah spoke then, unexpectedly, his voice quieter than the others. "It is just a hallway," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough to be heard, and the group shifted slightly, the formation loosening for a second, and Trent glanced at him, a quick look that carried more than words, and Noah dropped his gaze, adjusting his backpack again, stepping back half a step as if that could make him less visible, and the moment stretched, thin and uncertain, until a teacher's voice called out from down the hall, not directed at anyone in particular, just a reminder that this was still a school, still a place with rules, even if they were not always followed, and Trent let out a short breath, a sound that could have been a laugh if it had been lighter, and he stepped aside, giving them space to pass, but not before saying, "We will see," quiet, almost friendly, like a promise instead of a threat, and Isaiah did not respond, did not look back, he just kept walking, Elijah beside him, their pace unchanged, their shoulders level, and the hallway opened up again, the tension thinning as distance grew, conversations resuming, footsteps blending into the background, but something had shifted, something that did not fade with the noise, and Elijah spoke after a few seconds, voice low, controlled, "He is not done," and Isaiah nodded once, not slowing. "No." And they moved toward the exit doors at the end of the hall, where the late afternoon lights spilled in brighter now, warmer, cutting through the cooler tones of the building, and as they pushed through, the air outside felt different, clearer, but not lighter, and Isaiah glanced back just once through the glass, catching a glimpse of Trent still standing there, watching, not moving, and for a moment their eyes met again through the reflection, distorted slightly by the surface, but clear enough to understand, and Isaiah turned away, stepping fully into the light, knowing the space between them was only temporary. The parking lot stretched wide under the late afternoon sun, lines of cars reflecting gold and silver in uneven patches, heat still rising faintly from the asphalt even as the day began to cool, and Isaiah slowed his steps just enough to let the noise of the building fall away behind them, the heavy doors closing with a muted thud that sealed off the voices, the laughter, the tension that had followed them all day, and for a moment there was only the open air, the distant hum of traffic beyond. The campus, the rustle of leaves from a row of trees that bordered the lot, and Elijah exhaled like he had been holding something in since lunch, not sharp, not dramatic, just a slow release that settled into his shoulders, and he rolled them once, loosening the tightness that had been there all afternoon, and Isaiah noticed it, the way he always did, the small adjustments that most people would miss, and he nodded toward the far corner of the lot without saying anything, a silent suggestion. And Elijah followed his gaze, then started walking that way, their path angling away from the main flow of students, away from the clusters of conversations and the occasional glance that still lingered on them. And as they moved farther out, the sound changed, softer now, less crowded, footsteps more distinct, the wind more noticeable as it brushed against their clothes. And Elijah spoke first, his voice low but no longer held back. "He is going to keep pushing." And Isaiah did not answer right away, letting the words settle, letting the space hold them for a second, and then he said, "Yeah, simple, steady, like acknowledging something that had already been decided," and they reached the edge of the lot where a narrow strip of grass met the pavement, a place most students ignored, and Isaiah stepped off onto it. The ground slightly uneven under his sneakers, and Elijah followed, the shift in surface. Subtle but enough to change the way they stood, the way they balanced, and for a moment neither of them spoke, just stood there, the sunlight softer now, casting long shadows that stretched behind them, and Isaiah lifted his hands slightly, not in defense, not in display, just raising them to chest level, palms relaxed, fingers loose, and Elijah watched, understanding immediately, and he mirrored the motion, his stance adjusting without thought, feet settling into a position that looked casual to anyone passing by but carried something precise underneath, something learned, something practiced, and the air between them shifted again, quieter now, focused, and Isaiah moved first, not fast, not aggressive, just a small step, a shift of weight, and Elijah responded, matching it, the two of them moving in a slow, controlled pattern that had no audience, no need for one, their motions smooth, measured, each step connected to the next like a conversation without words and the sounds of. The lot faded further, replaced by the rhythm of their breathing, the soft scrape of rubber soles against grass, the faint rustle of fabric as they turned and adjusted. And Isaiah spoke as he moved, his voice even. You felt it earlier. And Elijah nodded, eyes focused. Yeah. And he shifted again, redirecting his balance with a precision that spoke of something deeper than instinct. And Isaiah continued, that is what he wants. Not a question, not a warning, just a statement, and Elijah exhaled, stepping back slightly, resetting his stance. I know. And there was a pause, not empty, just full of understanding, and Isaiah lowered his hands slowly, letting them fall to his sides, and Elijah did the same, the moment easing without breaking, and they stood there for a second longer, the sunlight catching the edge of Elijah's face, highlighting the calm that had returned, the control that had not been lost, just tested, and Isaiah glanced toward the building, the glass doors reflecting the sky now, hiding whatever was happening inside, and he said, we are not there anymore, and Elijah followed his gaze, then nodded once, no, and he looked back at his hands, flexing his fingers once, then letting them rest, and there was something in that motion, something quiet and certain, like a decision being reaffirmed without needing to be spoken, and a car door slammed somewhere across the lot, breaking the stillness just enough to remind them that the world was still moving, still watching in its own way, and Elijah let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, lighter this time. Mom would say we are overthinking it, and Isaiah's mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile but close. She would say do not let them choose who you become, and Elijah nodded, the words settling in a way that steadied him further, and for a moment the tension from earlier felt distant, not gone, but contained, like something placed carefully on a shelf where it could not spill over, and Isaiah took a step back toward the pavement, signaling the end of the moment, and Elijah followed, their movements returning to something more ordinary, more familiar, and as they walked toward the street, the light dimming slightly as the sun dipped lower, the air cooling just enough to be noticed, Isaiah glanced once more toward the school, not searching, not expecting, just aware, and he felt it again, that quiet sense of something waiting, something that had not finished unfolding, and he did not speak it, did not need to, because Elijah felt it too, the same way he had all day, and as they reached the sidewalk, the sound of footsteps behind them returned, faint at first, then clearer, not hurried, not hidden, just there, like a shadow that had followed them out into the open. The footsteps behind them stayed steady, not speeding up, not falling back, just keeping a distance that felt intentional, like whoever followed wanted to be noticed but not confronted, and Isaiah did not turn this time. He simply adjusted his path slightly along the sidewalk, guiding them toward the quieter side of the street where fewer students walked and the shadows from the trees stretched longer across the concrete, and Elijah caught it. Immediately, shifting with him, their pace unchanged but their direction more deliberate, and the air outside carried a different kind of sound now. Distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere far off, the low hum of a passing car, all of it softer than the school, but somehow sharper, like every noise had more space to breathe, and Elijah spoke without looking back, his voice low, controlled, still there, and Isaiah nodded once, eyes forward. Yeah, and they walked a few more steps before. Isaiah slowed, not stopping completely, just enough to let the distance close on its own terms, and the footsteps behind them adjusted too, shortening slightly, confirming what they already knew. And then Isaiah turned, smooth, unhurried, not a reaction but a choice, and Elijah turned with him, both of them facing the direction they had just come from. And there, about 10 feet away, stood Noah, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly tense like he had not expected them to stop so soon. And for a second none of them spoke, the space between them filled with the quiet of late afternoon, the light catching the edge of Noah's face, making his expression harder to read. And Isaiah studied him, not aggressively, not suspiciously, just taking in what was there, the uncertainty, the hesitation, the way Noah shifted his weight from one foot to the other like he was deciding whether to stay or walk away. And Elijah's gaze moved between them, alert but calm, and Noah finally exhaled, a small breath that seemed to carry more weight than it should. "I am not here for that," he said, his voice quieter than it had been in the hallway, stripped of the easy confidence he carried around the others. And Isaiah did not respond right away, letting the words settle, letting Noah feel the silence. And then he said, "Then what are you here for?" Not sharp, not demanding, just direct. And Noah glanced back toward the school, then back at them, like he was making sure no one else had followed. And he stepped a little closer, not enough to close the gap, just enough to show he was choosing to stay. "You should know," he said, pausing, searching for the right way to say it. "Trent does not let things go." And Elijah let out a quiet breath, almost a scoff but not quite. "We figured that out." And Noah nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "He is setting something up," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, like the words themselves were something he did not fully trust. "Gym tomorrow. After school, he is telling people you will not show, that you will back down." And the air shifted again, not heavier, not lighter, just more focused, like a line had been drawn somewhere neither side could ignore. And Isaiah watched Noah carefully, measuring not just the words, but the way they were said, the pauses, the tension, the lack of performance. And he asked, "Why tell us?" Simple, but it carried more than curiosity. And Noah looked down for a second, then back up, his expression tightening. "Because it is not right," he said, and there was something in that, something that did not match the rest of the day, something that stood slightly apart from the pattern they had seen. And Elijah studied him now, more closely, like he was trying to decide if this was another move in the same game or something different. And Noah added, "He wants a reaction, something he can put online, make it look like you started it." And Elijah's fingers flexed once at his side, then stilled, and Isaiah nodded slowly, the pieces fitting together without needing to be spoken out loud. And for a moment none of them moved, the late sunlight stretching their shadows across the sidewalk, long and thin, overlapping just slightly where they stood. And a car passed on the street, the sound fading quickly, leaving the quiet behind again. And Elijah finally spoke, his voice even, controlled. "We are not doing that." And Noah nodded quickly, like he expected that answer. "I know," he said, "that is the point." And Isaiah held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not agreement, not trust, just acknowledgement. And Noah stepped back slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction, like saying it out loud had shifted something for him too. And he glanced once more toward the school, then back at them. "Just be ready," he said, the words simple but carrying more weight than the tone suggested. And then he turned, walking back the way he came, his steps quicker now, like he did not want to linger in whatever space this was. And Isaiah watched him go for a second, then turned forward again. And Elijah exhaled slowly. "You believe him?" Not a question, just a statement. And Isaiah started walking again, his pace steady. "He believes what he said." And Elijah nodded, falling into step beside him. And the sidewalk stretched ahead, the light fading a little more with each step. And the quiet between them felt different now, not empty, not uncertain, but filled with something waiting to unfold. And Elijah glanced toward the horizon, then back at Isaiah. "Tomorrow then." And Isaiah did not answer right away, his gaze fixed ahead, his breathing steady. And after a moment he said, "Tomorrow." And neither of them spoke again as they continued down the path, the space behind them finally empty, but the weight of what had just been set in motion following close enough to feel. The apartment was quiet in the way that came after long days, not silent, but settled. The low hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of a clock that hung slightly crooked on the wall, the distant echo of a television from another unit bleeding through the thin walls. And Isaiah pushed the door open with his shoulder, stepping inside first, letting it close softly behind them as Elijah dropped his backpack near the couch without looking. His movements slower now, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of everything that had followed them home. And for a moment neither of them spoke, just stood there in the small living room where the air smelled faintly of laundry detergent and something warm left over from the morning. And Isaiah moved toward the kitchen counter, setting his keys down with a quiet click, grounding himself in something familiar, something controlled, and Elijah leaned back against the wall, his eyes tracing the edges of the room like he was seeing it differently. Tonight, like the space itself had shifted, and after a few seconds he said, "Gym tomorrow." Not asking, not doubting, just placing it there between them, and Isaiah nodded once, opening the cabinet without really looking, then closing it again, his focus not on what he was doing but on the rhythm of it, the small actions that kept everything steady. "Yeah," he said, and Elijah pushed off the wall, pacing once across the room. Then back, his steps measured but restless in a way that had not shown outside, and he ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply before catching himself, the sound cutting off halfway like he had decided it was too much. And Isaiah watched him for a second, then said quietly, "You are holding it." And Elijah stopped, turning slightly. "I have to," he replied, his voice lower now, controlled again. But there was something underneath it, something that had not fully settled. And Isaiah stepped closer, not crowding him, just enough to be present. "You do not have to carry all of it," he said. And Elijah let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "Feels like it." And he glanced toward the kitchen, toward the empty space where their mother would usually be by now, moving between counters, asking about their day in that steady voice that made everything feel smaller, more manageable. And Isaiah followed his gaze, then checked the time on his phone. "She is on late shift," he said. And Elijah nodded, the reminder landing quietly, and he walked over to the table, pulling out a chair and sitting down, elbows resting on the surface, his hands clasped together loosely in front of him. And for a moment he just looked at them, like he was measuring something only he could feel. And Isaiah moved to the other side, sitting across from him, the distance between them small, but enough to hold the space of the conversation, and the light above flickered once before settling, casting a soft glow over the table. And Elijah spoke again, his voice steady but quieter now. "Last time we said that too." And Isaiah did not need to ask what he meant, the words carrying their own history, and he nodded slowly. "Yeah." And Elijah's gaze did not lift, and it still got out of control. And there it was, not loud, not dramatic, just a fact placed carefully on the table between them. And Isaiah leaned back slightly, his chair creaking under the shift, and he let the silence sit for a moment, not avoiding it, not rushing to fill it. And then he said, "That was not just you." And Elijah shook his head once, small but firm. "Does not matter," he replied, and his fingers tightened briefly, then loosened again. And Isaiah watched that movement, the same way he had watched it earlier, the same way he always did. And he leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. "It matters to me." And Elijah finally looked up, meeting his eyes, and for a second the tension softened, just enough to show something underneath, something that had nothing to do with Trent or the school, or any of it, something older, deeper. And Elijah exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I just do not want to go back to that," he said. And Isaiah nodded, the words landing exactly where they were meant to. "We are not," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just certainty. And Elijah studied him for a second, like he was testing that certainty, weighing it against everything that had already happened. And then he nodded once, slower this time. "Okay." And the room settled again, the tension easing just a fraction, not gone, but contained. And Isaiah reached over, tapping the table lightly with his fingers, a small, familiar rhythm. And Elijah mirrored it without thinking, the pattern, sinking between them like it always had. And for a moment it felt like something solid again, something they could hold on to. And then Isaiah said, "We show up." And Elijah nodded. "We show up." And Isaiah continued, "We do not give him what he wants." And Elijah's jaw tightened briefly, then relaxed. "We control it," he said, and Isaiah held his gaze. "We choose it." And the words settled into the space between them, not as a plan, not as a strategy, but as something deeper, something that had already been decided long before this moment. And outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights briefly cutting across the window, casting moving shadows on the wall before fading away, and Elijah leaned back further in his chair, his shoulders finally dropping a little, the tension loosening just enough to breathe, and Isaiah stood, moving toward the kitchen again, this time actually opening the cabinet, pulling out 2 glasses, filling them with water, the simple action, grounding the moment again. And he set one down in front of Elijah, who picked it up, taking a slow sip, his eyes still thoughtful, still focused somewhere just beyond the room. And Isaiah watched him for a second, then looked down at his own hands, flexing his fingers once before letting them rest, and for a brief moment, everything felt still, balanced on something quiet and steady, like the calm before a decision had to be tested. And Elijah set the glass down, the soft clink against the table barely breaking the silence. And he looked at Isaiah, his expression clearer now, more resolved, and he said, "Tomorrow, we keep it clean." And Isaiah nodded once, firm, clean, and the word hung there, simple but heavy, and neither of them spoke after that. The room holding on to the quiet, the weight of what was coming, settling into place, and somewhere deep under it all, something waited, patient, steady, ready to see if that choice would hold. The morning came in quietly, not with noise but with light, pale and thin through the apartment window, stretching across the floor and climbing slowly up the wall, as if it was taking its time. And Isaiah was already awake, sitting at the edge of his bed with his hands resting loosely on his knees, his breathing steady, measured, the same rhythm he had held onto the night before. And for a moment he did not move, just listened. The low hum of the building, the distant sound of a car starting. Somewhere outside, the faint ticking of that same crooked clock in the other room. And then he stood, moving through the apartment with quiet familiarity, stepping over the places where the floor creaked, pouring a glass of water, taking a slow drink as he looked out the window at the street below, where the world was already moving, people heading somewhere, carrying their own mornings with them. And behind him Elijah stirred, the soft shift of blankets, the sound of a breath that caught for just a second before settling. And Isaiah turned slightly, not fully, just enough to know he was awake. And Elijah sat up, running a hand over his face before letting it rest there for a moment, like he was gathering himself before the day could begin. And then he dropped his hand and looked across the room, his eyes finding Isaiah without searching, and for a second neither of them spoke, the quiet holding steady between them, not empty, just full of everything they already understood. And Elijah swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet touching the floor with a soft thud, grounding him in the moment. And he said, "Today." Not as a question, not as a statement, just a word placed carefully in the space between them. And Isaiah nodded once. "Today." And the word settled, carrying more than it needed to, and they moved through the morning without rushing, each action deliberate, brushing teeth, pulling on hoodies, lacing sneakers, the small routines that made everything feel normal even when it was not. And when they stepped outside, the air was cooler than the day before, sharper, carrying the faint scent of damp pavement from a light rain overnight, and the sky was a soft gray, the sun hidden but present, diffused across the clouds. And they walked side by side toward the bus stop, their pace steady, their steps matching without thought. And the neighborhood felt different in the morning, quieter, more contained, like the day had not fully opened yet. And Elijah glanced down at his hands as they walked, flexing his fingers once, then letting them relax. And Isaiah noticed, like he always did, and said, quietly, "Still clean." And Elijah nodded, "Still clean." And the words were simple, but they held something firm, something that had been decided and would not be easily moved. And the bus arrived with a low hiss, doors folding open, and they stepped on without hesitation, finding seats near the middle, not hidden, not exposed, just there. And the ride passed in a blur of passing streets and quiet conversations, the hum of the engine steady beneath it all. And when they reached the school, the building stood the same as it had the day before, tall, polished, unchanged, But something about it felt different now, not because it had changed, but because they had. And as they stepped off the bus, Isaiah felt that same quiet awareness settle in his chest. Not heavy, not sharp, just present, like a line he could not see but knew was there. And Elijah exhaled slowly beside him, his gaze fixed on the entrance. "We show up," he said, and Isaiah nodded. "We show up." And they walked forward. Through the doors, into the hallway where the day had already begun, students moving, voices rising, the familiar rhythm of school wrapping around them again. But beneath it all, there was something else, something waiting, and as they moved through the crowd, Isaiah caught fragments of conversation, words like gym, after school, something happening, passed from one voice to another like a current moving through water, and Elijah heard it too, his jaw tightening just a fraction before settling again. And they did not stop, did not slow, just kept moving, their path steady, their focus clear, and as they reached their lockers, Isaiah opened his, the metal door swinging out with a soft creak, and inside, everything was exactly where it should be, books stacked, a folded paper tucked into the corner, the order of it grounding in a way nothing else could, and Elijah leaned against the locker next to him, his shoulder brushing the cool metal, and he glanced down the hallway, where clusters of students had begun to form, small groups that shifted and grew as more people arrived. And somewhere in that movement, Isaiah saw Trent, not standing still this time, but moving through the crowd with an ease that suggested control, like he was already shaping the day without needing to say it out loud. And for a second their eyes met across the distance, not long, not dramatic, just enough to confirm what both of them already knew, and Trent's expression did not change, did not need to. The intent already clear, and Isaiah closed his locker slowly, the sound of the metal clicking into place sharper than it should have been, and Elijah pushed off from his own, standing upright, his posture relaxed but ready in a way that did not show to anyone who was not looking for it. And neither of them spoke as they turned toward their first class, the hallway stretching out ahead of them like any other morning, but carrying something underneath it, something that would not stay hidden for long. And as they walked, the noise around them seemed to shift again, not louder, not quieter, just more focused, like the day itself was narrowing toward a single point, and Isaiah felt it settle, steady and certain. And he knew without needing to say it that whatever was waiting would not stay contained much longer. The day did not rush, it stretched, each class passing with a kind of quiet tension that never fully left, like a note held just below hearing. And by the time the final bell rang, the air in the hallways felt different, charged in a way that had nothing to do with school anymore. Lockers slamming louder than usual, voices overlapping with a sharper edge, groups forming and reforming as if pulled by something unseen, and Isaiah closed his locker slowly, the metal click echoing just a fraction longer than it should have, and Elijah stood beside him, his posture relaxed but still, like he had already settled into the decision they made the night before. And neither of them needed to say it again. It was already there, steady between them. And as they turned, the current of students moving toward the exits split around them, some heading out, some drifting the other way, toward the gym, toward whatever had been building all day. And Isaiah caught it in fragments again, low voices, quick glances, phones already in hands. And Elijah exhaled once, slow, controlled. "It is already happening." And Isaiah nodded. "Yeah." And they did not rush, did not slow, they simply moved, their steps even as they followed the flow toward the back of the building, where the hallway opened into a wider space, the polished floor reflecting the overhead lights in long strips that seemed to guide the way. And the closer they got, the more the sound changed, less scattered now, more focused, voices gathering into a single direction. And when they reached the gym doors, they were already propped open, the space beyond bright and wide, filled with students lining the edges of the court, some sitting on the bleachers, others standing in clusters, the low murmur of anticipation filling the air like a steady hum. And Isaiah paused just at the threshold, not hesitating, just taking it in, the layout, the distance, the exits, the way the crowd shifted and made space without meaning to. And Elijah stood beside him, his gaze sweeping once across the room, then settling forward, and for a moment the noise seemed to dim, not actually quieter, just less important. And then Trent stepped into view from the far side of the court, moving with that same easy confidence, his hands loose at his sides, his expression calm in a way that suggested he had been waiting for this exact moment all day. And the crowd reacted to him without realizing it, a subtle shift, a widening of space, like the room itself adjusted to his presence. And Isaiah watched him approach, not moving, not reacting, just letting the distance close on its own. And Elijah stood just slightly forward now, not in front, not behind, just aligned. And as Trent stopped a few feet away, the space between them felt deliberate, measured, like a line drawn without being marked, and he smiled, not wide this time, just enough to show he was in control. "You came," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quieting room, and Elijah's response was simple, even, "We said we would." And there was no extra weight in it, no challenge, just a statement that landed cleanly, and Trent tilted his head slightly, studying them, like he was recalculating something. And he glanced briefly at the crowd, at the phones already raised, the attention fixed, and then back at them. "People thought you would not," he said, and Isaiah finally spoke, his voice steady, clear, "We do not do that." And for a second the words hung there, simple but solid, and something in the room shifted again, not loud, not obvious, just a subtle change in how people held themselves, how they watched. And Trent let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "Good," he said, and he stepped back slightly, gesturing toward the open space on the court, not pushing, not forcing, just inviting in a way that was more calculated than it appeared. And Elijah glanced once at Isaiah, a quick look that carried everything they needed, and Isaiah gave the smallest nod, and they stepped forward together, their movements smooth, unhurried, the space opening around them as they walked onto the court, the polished floor cool under their feet, the lines painted across it sharp and clear, and the noise of the crowd settled into a low murmur again, the kind that comes before something is about to begin. And Trent moved to the opposite side, turning to face them, his posture loose but attentive, like he was ready for whatever he believed this would be. And Isaiah stood still for a moment, letting the space settle, letting the energy of the room pass through without taking hold. And Elijah mirrored him, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing steady, and for a brief second, everything felt suspended, the crowd, the light, the sound, all of it held in place by something invisible, and Isaiah could feel it, that same quiet line from earlier, now drawn clearly in front of them, not something to cross, but something to hold. And he lowered his gaze slightly, just enough to center himself, and when he looked up again, his expression had not changed, but something in it had settled deeper, something that would not move easily. And across from him, Trent's smile faded just a fraction, not gone, just less certain than before, and the room seemed to lean in, waiting, without knowing exactly for what. And Isaiah took a slow breath, the air steady in his chest, and he knew the next moment would decide more than anyone here realized. No one said start, but something shifted anyway, a subtle release in the room like a breath being let out all at once. And Trent moved first, not rushing, not dramatic, just stepping forward with that same casual confidence, his sneakers squeaking lightly against the polished floor. And Elijah did not mirror the motion, did not step in. He simply adjusted his stance, a small shift of weight that most people would miss. But Isaiah saw it, the way his center settled, the way his shoulders stayed loose, and Isaiah remained where he was, not withdrawing, not advancing, just present, his hands relaxed at his sides, and the crowd leaned in without realizing it. Phones raised a little higher, whispers fading into a low hum that filled the edges of the gym, and Trent circled slightly, like he was testing space, testing reaction, his eyes fixed on Elijah now, measuring, waiting for something to push against. And Elijah's gaze stayed steady, not locked, not aggressive, just aware, following, without chasing. And for a second it almost looked like nothing was happening at all, just three people standing on a court under bright lights. But the stillness carried weight. And then Trent stepped closer, closing the gap just enough to force a response. And Elijah moved, not back, not forward, just to the side, a smooth shift that redirected the space without breaking it. And a murmur ran through the crowd, small but noticeable, and Trent paused, just for a fraction of a second, like he had expected resistance and found something else instead. And he adjusted, stepping again, a little sharper this time, and Elijah responded the same way, calm, controlled, his movement precise without being showy, like he was answering a question that had already been asked, and Isaiah watched it all, his focus not on Trent, not even on Elijah entirely, but on the space between them, the way it changed, the way it held, and he could feel it, the line they had talked about, not crossed, not even touched, just there, guiding everything, and Trent's expression shifted slightly, the easy smile tightening at the edges as he tried a different angle, a different approach, stepping in closer, testing again, and Elijah adjusted again, his feet barely making a sound, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady, and there was no escalation, no reaction for Trent to hold on to, nothing that could be turned into what he wanted. And that was when the room began to understand, not fully, not all at once, but in pieces, in small realizations that passed from one person to another, that this was not what they expected, that this was not a show of force but something else entirely, something quieter, something harder to read, and Trent exhaled, a short breath that carried a hint of frustration, and he stopped, moving for a second, looking directly at Elijah now, like he was trying to force a moment into existence, and Elijah met his gaze, calm, steady, and said, "You are done." Not loud, not sharp, just clear, and the words landed in the space between them without weight, but with certainty, and for a second everything stilled, the crowd, the sound, even the air seemed to hold, and Trent blinked, just once, like the moment had slipped slightly out of his control, and he stepped back, not retreating, just creating space again, his expression unreadable now, the confidence still there but altered, less certain, less complete, and Isaiah took a slow breath, the tension in his chest easing just a fraction, not because it was over, but because something had shifted in a way he recognized, and Elijah lowered his hands slightly, not dropping them fully, just enough to show the change, the control, and the crowd began to murmur again, louder now, the sound building as people tried to make sense of what they had just seen, phones lowering slightly, conversations starting in quick, quiet bursts, and Trent glanced around, taking in the reactions, the lack of what he had expected, and something in his posture changed, subtle but real, like the ground under him was not as solid as it had been a moment ago, and he looked back at Elijah, then at Isaiah, and for a second there was no performance left, just a flicker of something more human, more uncertain, and he let out a breath, longer this time, and said, "This is not over." But the words did not carry the same weight they had before, not as a threat, not as a promise, just something said because it needed to be said, and Elijah nodded once, calm. "It does not have to be." And that landed differently, quieter but deeper, and Trent did not respond. Right away, his gaze lingering for a second longer before he turned slightly, stepping back toward the edge of the court, the space opening again, the tension loosening in a way that felt unfamiliar to everyone watching, and Isaiah stepped forward then, not into conflict, not into challenge, just to stand beside Elijah again, their positions aligning without thought, and for a moment they stood there, the noise of the gym rising around them, the moment dissolving into something less defined, but not forgotten, and Isaiah glanced at Elijah, just a quick look, enough to confirm, enough to understand, and Elijah's shoulders dropped slightly, the control still there, the choice still intact, and as they turned to step off the court, the crowd parted again, not out of fear, not out of command, but out of something quieter, something closer to respect, and the space they left behind felt different now, not empty, but changed, like something had been proven without needing to be shown. And as they walked toward the exit, Isaiah felt the weight of the moment settle in a new way, not heavy, not sharp, just clear, and he knew that whatever came next would not look the same as what had been planned. The noise did not fade all at once, it unraveled, voices rising in uneven waves as people tried to make sense of what they had just seen, phones lowering but not fully put away, conversations breaking into small clusters that followed Isaiah and Elijah as they stepped off the court, not chasing, not crowding, just orbiting at a distance that felt different from before, less sharp, less certain, and Isaiah kept his pace steady, not rushing toward the exit, not slowing to absorb the attention, just moving forward like the moment behind them had already been placed where it belonged. And Elijah walked beside him, His shoulders relaxed now in a way that had not been possible earlier, his breathing even, controlled, and for a second it almost felt like the gym was just another room again, not a stage, not a test, just a place people would forget once something else took its place. And then a voice cut through, not loud, but clear enough to reach them. Isaiah. And he stopped, not abruptly, just enough to acknowledge, turning slightly as Principal Whitmore stepped into their path, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone used to managing situations before they became something else. And behind her the assistant coach lingered near the edge of the court, arms folded, watching without stepping in, and Isaiah met her gaze, calm, steady, and she looked between him and Elijah, taking in the details, the lack of chaos, the absence of what she might have expected, and she said, "I need a word, not a demand, not a request, just something in between." And Elijah glanced at Isaiah, a quick look that carried no tension, only awareness, and Isaiah nodded once. Of course. And they followed her a few steps away from the crowd, toward the sideline where the noise softened just enough to make space for conversation, and she folded her hands in front of her, taking a small breath before speaking. "I have been informed there was an incident planned," she said, choosing her words carefully, and Isaiah did not interrupt, did not correct. He simply listened, and she continued, "What I saw just now was not that." And there was a slight shift in her tone, something less formal, more direct, and Elijah spoke this time, his voice even. "We did not come for that." And she held his gaze for a second, then nodded slowly, like she was aligning what she saw with what she had been told, and behind them the murmur of the crowd continued, quieter now, less focused, already beginning to disperse, and then another voice entered. Hesitant but clear. "That is true." And they turned to see Lila standing a few feet away, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her posture uncertain but her expression firm, and Principal Whitmore raised an eyebrow slightly. "You are," she prompted, and Lila stepped forward just enough. "Lila Monroe," she said, and she glanced briefly at Isaiah and Elijah before continuing. "This has been building all day, maybe longer, and they did not start it." And the words landed simply, without drama, but they carried weight, and Principal Whitmore's gaze sharpened just a fraction, not suspicious, but more focused, and she nodded once. "I see," she said, and for a moment the three of them stood there, the space holding something quieter than before, something closer to clarity, and then she turned her attention back to Isaiah and Elijah. "You handled that with restraint," she said, the word deliberate. And Isaiah inclined his head slightly, acknowledging without accepting praise, and Elijah did not speak, his posture already shifting toward leaving, toward moving forward, and Principal Whitmore seemed to understand, stepping back just enough to clear their path. "I will address the rest," she added, her tone returning to its measured calm. But there was something different in it now, something more certain, and Isaiah nodded once. "Thank you." And they moved past her, the exit doors ahead of them now, the late afternoon light spilling in brighter than before, and as they stepped through, the air outside felt lighter, not because the situation had ended, but because something had changed in how it would continue, and Elijah let out a slow breath, the kind that carried both release and recognition, and he said quietly, "That was not what he wanted," and Isaiah shook his head slightly, "No," and they walked down the steps, the sound of the doors closing behind them softer now, less final, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet settling again, familiar now, steady, and then Elijah glanced back once, through the glass, catching a glimpse of Trent still inside, standing near the edge of the court, his posture different, less certain, like the ground under him had shifted in a way he could not fully control, and Elijah turned forward again, his expression calm, and he said, "He is going to feel that," and Isaiah nodded once, his gaze fixed ahead. "He already does," and they continued down the path, the light stretching longer across the pavement, the day beginning to fold into evening, and behind them, inside the gym, something that had been certain before was no longer as solid as it seemed. The evening settled slowly, the sky turning from soft gray to a deeper blue that stretched quietly above the street, and the campus behind them grew distant with each step, its noise fading into something that no longer reached them the same way. and Isaiah walked beside Elijah in that familiar rhythm again, steady, unhurried, the kind of pace that did not need to prove anything. And for a while neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence itself carried enough, the kind that comes after something has been tested and held. And Elijah finally let out a breath that felt different from the others, lighter, not because everything was over, but because something inside him had shifted, and he glanced down at his hands again, flexing his fingers once, then letting them rest at his sides. And this time there was no tension in the motion, no hidden edge, just movement. And Isaiah noticed, like he always did, and he nodded slightly, not drawing attention to it, just acknowledging it. And Elijah caught the nod, a small smile touching the corner of his mouth before fading back into calm. And he said, "It held." And Isaiah answered without hesitation, "It did." And the words were simple, but they carried something deeper than any explanation could. And they reached the edge of the sidewalk where the streetlight flickered on above them, casting a warm circle of light that stretched across the pavement. And for a moment they stood there, not stopping for any reason except that the moment asked for it. And Elijah leaned back slightly, looking up at the light, then at the sky beyond it. And he said quietly, "Feels different." And Isaiah followed his gaze, the quiet above them steady and wide. And he said, "It is." And the difference was not in the world around them, not in the school, or the people, or the way things would continue tomorrow. It was in something smaller, something that could not be seen from the outside, something that had been tested and had not broken. And Elijah lowered his gaze again, looking ahead down the street where the path continued. And he nodded once, more certain now. And they started walking again, their steps falling back into that same rhythm. And somewhere behind them a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the road before disappearing. And the night settled further, quieter, more still. And as they reached their building, the familiar outline of it grounding in a way that nothing else could, Elijah pushed the door open and held it for Isaiah, a small gesture that needed no comment. And they stepped inside, the hallway dim but warm, the same faint sounds of other lives moving behind closed doors. And for a second it felt like nothing had changed at all, like the day had been just another day, but the weight of it remained, not heavy, just present. And Isaiah paused, near the stairs, glancing at Elijah. And Elijah met his gaze, the understanding there without needing words. And he said, "We keep it." And Isaiah nodded, "We keep it." And they moved upstairs, their footsteps soft against the worn carpet, the quiet holding steady around them. And when they reached their apartment, the door opened to the same small space, the same hum of the refrigerator, the same crooked clock ticking on the wall. And yet it felt different now. Not because anything had changed, but because they had carried something back with them, something that would not be taken easily. And Elijah set his backpack down again, slower this time, more deliberate. And he walked to the table, resting his hands on its surface, not gripping, just placing them there. And Isaiah moved to the kitchen, filling 2 glasses of water the same way he had the night before, the repetition grounding the moment. And when he set one down in front of Elijah, their hands brushed briefly, a small contact that carried more meaning than it seemed. And Elijah looked up, his expression calm, clear, and he said, "He expected something else." And Isaiah nodded, "Yeah." And Elijah added, after a second, "He will not forget this." And Isaiah held his gaze, steady, "Neither will we." And the room settled again, the quiet wrapping around them in that familiar way. And outside, the night deepened, the streetlight casting its steady glow through the window. And for a moment everything felt still, not empty, not uncertain, just complete in a way that did not need anything more. And Isaiah leaned back against the counter, his arms relaxed at his sides. And Elijah sat down slowly, his shoulders no longer carrying the tension from before. And the air between them held that same quiet understanding, not spoken, not explained, just there. And in that stillness, something simple became clear, not in words, not in any single moment, but in the way the day had unfolded, in the choices that had been made and held. That strength was not what most people thought it was, not loud, not forceful, not something you had to show for it to be real. And Elijah looked down at his hands one last time, then back up. And this time he did not check them, did not measure anything. He just let them rest. And Isaiah watched him for a second, then looked away, toward the window, toward the quiet outside. and the world moved on, the same as it always did. But something had shifted, something small and steady that would not easily be undone, and neither of them needed to say it out loud, because they both felt it, the same way they had felt it all along, and it stayed with them as the night settled in, quiet and certain, like a promise that had already been kept.